Big day for South Africa. But are we overly excited about South Africa's entry into BRICS? Is it because we merit being there, or do they just need a demographic, just an African player who's also part of the group?
No, I don't think this is actually something that we should be ashamed about or something that we should be bashful about as well. This is a recognition of the potential of the African continent. I think if you step back and you look at global growth rates, Africa is the second largest growth economy in the world after Asia. So this, I think, is a huge acknowledgement on our part.
Jim O'Neill, who actually coined the acronym BRICS, suggests that South Africa doesn't deserve to be there. For the first part, South Africa's economy is just a quarter of the size of Russia's economy. He reckons that a country like Nigeria would probably be a more credible representative with GDP in excess of 7%, huge population, and really endowed with oil reserves that are much needed at this time. And those sorts of technicalities being raised as to South Africa's qualification as a BRIC member state.
Look, Loretta, I think the fact remains that South Africa has the largest economy in sub-Saharan, actually in Africa, period. I think secondly, when you look at the penetration of South African corporates into the rest of Africa, there is no other country that actually has the same type of corporate critical mass in the rest of Africa as does South Africa. There are challenges. You know, South Africa has to be able to harness and has to be able to be seen as this gateway to Africa and create a regulatory regime, create an environment where foreign investors and foreign companies actually do see it as playing this particular role.
When we just hone in on this one issue, GDP, South Africa is an underperformer compared to any of the other BRIC member states that are growing above 8%, for instance. You also have the issue of population size, 49 million people versus a billion and over a billion in China and India. So in terms of a middle class to drive consumption, South Africa just doesn't quite have it. Can it compete?
You see, Loretta, I think that's sort of missing the mark just in terms of looking at South Africa on a standalone metric basis relative to the other BRIC countries. I'll tell you a good empirical point of that is that we have actually seen clients who have looked to South Africa as an entry point to the rest of Africa, look to actually get business done in South Africa, and then look to have that as a basis and as an entry point to the rest of Africa as well. The challenge is very clear, though. You know, the fact of the matter is that South Africa actually needs to make sure that from a regulatory environment, from an immigration perspective, just from an ease of doing business perspective, that it actually does create the conditions that companies actually can benefit from the rest of Africa.
On that tack, then, let's talk about the models for growth that we see in some of these BRIC economies. We know that India and China have been proponents and advocates of state-sponsored capitalism, where state investment banks, state development banks, state industrial companies inject investment in the local economy and even abroad. South Africa has a few national champions, but not with the capitalization that a lot of these other instruments that the Chinese and Indians have at their disposal.
I think that's generally true, and you know, we've seen some strides towards that direction. For example, we've seen some pronouncements in the last couple of days around IDC and their role in development plans just going forward for South Africa. I think what gets lost as well, especially in the Chinese case, is there's been a lot of modernization of state-owned enterprises in China in the course of the last year or so. The Agricultural Bank of China that went public last year was done with a lot of modernization prior to actually going public. So there is a balance between state role and private enterprise. And look, I think South Africa needs to find the same balance in its own economy as well.
The one thing that South Africa has in common with most of them, particularly Brazil, Russia and China, is the commodity play and the fact that it is a major commodity exporter and has gained significantly from the surging price in commodities and the capital inflows into this economy. What should the general approach be to free markets? Because a country like Brazil has been quite adamant that they will tax capital inflows.
Yeah, I think having a seat in this particular forum, I think, is a good thing for South Africa. You know, I think the fact of the matter is that if you look at what has happened in the course of the last 2 years, for example, if you look at it from a currency perspective, the different countries within the emerging markets have actually utilized different controls to stem the appreciation of the particular currency. To have one particular forum where you can actually agree on a unified method of stemming currency appreciation, I think, is something that's good for South Africa as well.
And what about the issue of the reserve currency and using the dollar to do so? I mean, this is a major issue that's been raised at the G20 and other fora like that, as to whether or not the dollar is a valid, worthwhile currency of the modern age.
Yeah, you know, and it's going to be an increasingly important question, especially as you start to see that the U.S. turn policy. And, you know, the U.S. actually has big fiscal problems that it's actually currently encountering. And as we know, China has actually embarked on a path right now to actually increase the convertibility of the renminbi. Having a seat in a particular forum like the BRIC, where you can actually influence the progression of the renminbi as a particular reserve currency, I think is something that South Africa wants.
Okay, and very briefly in 30 seconds, that's all we have. Countries like India and Brazil have been at the forefront of championing agricultural economies, and they're the ones who've lobbied extensively for freer trade within the WTO on the agricultural front. What can BRIC contribute to global food security, especially at a time like now?
You know, global food security is going to be paramount for a lot of emerging markets just going forward, especially with commodity prices having risen the way they have. I think that you know, in the case where you actually have emerging market countries that have excess capacity from an agricultural perspective, the BRIC nations can actually form a key role in being able to coordinate policy and being able to come up with policy announcements in the same way that the G20 or the G7 have actually done in the past as well.